Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. The corridors of power in Washington have long been haunted by a single intractable question. What to do when a regime that seems to thrive on confrontation, that draws strength from isolation, and that treats compromise not as diplomacy, but as defeat. For over 4 decades, 5 consecutive American administrations have grappled with the Islamic Republic of Iran, each believing they possess the key to unlocking this geopolitical Gordian knot. Each has been wrong. Today, we're joined by someone who brings a perspective as rare as it is essential, that of lived experience transformed into strategic insight. Shay Khatiri didn't just study the Iranian regime from the comfortable distance of think tank offices or university seminars. He lived under it, resisted it, fled from it, and now analyzes it with the cold clarity that only comes from having your own skin in the game. As a child, Khatiri was recruited by the very Basij militia forces he would later fight against in the streets during the 2009 Green Revolution. As a student, he was reported by regime informants for the simple act of flirting with a classmate. As a young man, he felt rubber bullets shatter his wrist and hid in strangers' houses while Basij thugs prowled outside, waiting to arrest him. These aren't abstract policy considerations for Khatiri. They're memories that still make his pulse quicken when Israeli strikes hit the headquarters of his former tormentors. But what makes his analysis truly compelling isn't just his personal history. It's how he's channeled that experience into a framework that challenges virtually every assumption underlying American Iran policy. While Washington debates the merits of engagement versus containment, Khatiri argues we're asking the wrong questions entirely. The issue isn't whether Iran will negotiate away its nuclear program. It's why a regime that derives its legitimacy from resistance to America would ever genuinely do so. In his writings, Khatiri has emerged as one of the most provocative voices in foreign policy analysis. He argues that Khomeini's greatest fear isn't military defeat. It's looking weak-willed to a sinking but critical base of support. Khatiri has long suggested that Israel, not America, may be the key to Iranian liberation, a historical irony that traces back to Cyrus the Great freeing the Jews from Babylon 25 centuries ago. As we sit today, with renewed Iranian repression simmering beneath the surface of Iranian society, and with a very fragile ceasefire, the question Khatiri raises have never been more urgent. Are we witnessing the last gasps of a dying regime, or the final sprint toward a nuclear-armed theocracy? In the end, will Israel's military action succeed where American diplomacy failed? And what happens to American strategy when the very deal we seek might destroy the regime we're negotiating with? To address all of this, it is my pleasure to welcome Shay Khatiri back to this program. Shay, thanks so much for joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. I want to talk first, because I know you've written passionately about this in your Substack, your reaction to Israel's initial strike on Iran a couple of weeks ago.
Several reactions to have for someone like me, and not all in coherence with each other. One is an American policy professional, which you look at it, and as a policy professional, that rather was to see that Israel is doing what we should have done a decade ago. It reflects an abdication of global responsibilities that the United States has, and you see that in Ukraine and Europe. You see that in the Middle East now, and I worry that we will see that in Asia. And the second reaction is, but Israel nonetheless is doing what should be done, which is good. That is something to celebrate and admire Israel for, be inspired by. Then there comes the personal question. People in Iran will be suffering from this war. A price is to be paid, and the suffering has not started even. That would be a much greater suffering, will be the revenge that the regime will take on the Iranian people for not coming to its defense during the war. All these come together in the mind of someone like me that, not just someone like me, I would think that any decent person who truly sees Iran and its nuclear program as a threat, but also has sympathy for the Iranian people, should have these reactions all at once. That ultimately, I would blame the United States for having taken so long to allow the problem to get to this point.
Talk about at what point you would have liked to have seen the U.S. take bolder action. How far back do we need to go?
Well, hindsight's 2020, of course.
Of course.
But it depends, Jeff. I would say that the evidence was always there that the regime like the Islamic Republic was incapable of reform and that its nuclear program was a source of legitimacy for the Islamic Republic, not just a matter of maximizing their foreign policy power. So I think that's always been there. And if you accept those facts, then you arrive at the inevitable conclusion that they will not give it up. I think Hadley, who was the special assistant to President Bush for National Security Affairs, or what colloquially is called National Security Advisor, he used to say there are two clocks at once regarding Iran. One is the countdown to get the bomb, and the other one is the countdown for the regime to collapse. The question is which one will happen first. And I think that was that was a consideration, and I thought that was a misguided idea because the regime was never going to collapse on its own. This is a totalitarian regime that has no qualms about killing its own people. But that, again, I'm trying to bring these anecdotes and facts up because there had always been, and remains so, an ignorance of the structure of the Islamic Republic that has led to faulty policies. So I think that by about 20 after the JCPOA, when you see that the Islamic Republic is not changing its conduct, it's quite obvious that any hope for entering Iran through a nuclear program into the global order is a folly. And on top of that, even if the JCPOA was being abided by, it's still by the admission of the president himself, President Obama himself. At the end of it, in 15 years, that would be in 2030, Iran would have been, this is in an interview with NPR that President Obama admitted, Iran would have been a week away from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So you're in a situation that the regime is proving not to be reformable with nuclear ambitions. And the best case scenario is that they will get their nuclear weapon at the end of the 15-year expiration of the Islamic Republic. I think at that point, it should be obvious that we should go after the program militarily.
Talk about the significance of the program, because the significance seems to have existed on two levels. One, the actual existential threat of Iran having a nuclear weapon, but also what the acquisition of it means to the current regime.
In 1979, you have the Islamic Revolution, and it is coming in with a reaction to a set of trends in Iran, and those reactions become the prescription for the regime that came to be. One is economic. Ronald Reagan had the three-legged stool of Republican platform, the social conservatism, economic conservatism, and foreign policy conservatism. Say that Khomeini had his three-legged stool in reaction to current trends at the time, or then trends, not current. One is economic leveling, what we would essentially say socialism, you could say populism, and anti-corruption. That we're going to go after the corruption of the elite and get rid of inequalities that exist in the society. So that's one. The second, and there's a famous speech by Khomeini that is talking about we will make utilities free, we will make bus rides free, we will things like that. Very populist messaging. And also going after the wealth that the elite had acquired under the Shah. The second one is obviously religious conservatism in the society, public enforcement of religious morality. And today, the best one in the United States is known to be the hijab law, the man compulsory hijab, but there are many others. And the third one is foreign policy, especially anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism. That's also the religious conservatism is in reaction to the secularization of the society, especially bigger cities, metropolitan cities. And foreign policy is in reaction to the Shah's foreign policy, which was aligned with the United States and informal but close relations with Israel. So you have these three as the revolutionary mandates. Then you come fast forward to 25 years later in the 2000s. You end up with first religious conservatism being resisted and pushed back against by the Iranian people. The hijab is going, if you visited Iran every 5 years, you will see that the hijab has gone further back on women's head an inch. First, there should have been no hair shown, and women should have worn long overalls from their shoulders down to their toes. The overalls and loose ones. The overalls became tighter, colorful, shorter, and hijab kept going back. Every 5 years, you could see the difference. Then you have girls and boys dating is not allowed. Pre-marriage, premarital dating is not allowed, but you suddenly see boys and girls are not in public going to cafes, and the state does not have the capacity to crack down on it. Now, the more you move forward in history, the more you see these trends. This is now the rest of it, what I'm about to say, these were happening in 2000s, early 2010s. And since then, since I left Iran, dog ownership is not allowed. Today, everybody has a dog walking them in the park. People buy alcohol in the black market. Alcohol is banned in Iran. The primary reason I moved out. You have people buying alcohol in black markets, going to restaurants and drinking the alcohol they brought from home at a restaurant, at a cafe. Public music, quote unquote, un-Islamic music is being played everywhere. Things like this. So religious conservatism is essentially dead. And one more thing, mosque attendance is almost nearing zero at this point. Very few people attend the mosque, even those who are religious. Iran's the religious population, people identified as Shiites, could be as low as 30% of the population today. And even the 30% rarely attend the mosque because they oppose the regime, and the mosque is associated with the regime. So they don't want to be accused of such as association of loyalty to the regime when the religious don't, when the pious don't attend the mosque. And up to 70,000 mosques have closed down in Iran over the past 10 years. So religious conservatism, which was a pillar of the Islamic Republic, does not exist anymore. The regime has lost that, or the state has lost that, I should say. Second, inequality has gotten much worse in Iran than under the Shah. The society is extremely impoverished, whereas the children of the elites are extremely wealthy and show off their wealth. You see on every street corner kids as young as 6 or 7 years old searching dumpster for food. And on the same street, you have $400,000, $500,000 cars being driven around by the son of some IRGC commander. So the regime lost that as well. And both of these trends had become quite highlighted by 2010, 2011, 2012, by around that time. Although they began happening in the 2000s and they were undeniable by the 2010s. When these trends are emerging, the state, when I say the regime, I am referring to the state plus its supporters. The state makes a compromise with its own supporters around this time, which is we are losing heaven at home. In exchange for it, we're going to make life hell abroad for our enemies, America and especially Israel. That's when you see, this is not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons, a major reason that you see Iran's foreign policy becoming much more aggressive in the 2000s and even more so in the 2010s, beginning with the Iraq War and then Syrian civil war involvement, then Iraq creation of the proxy network. That was a compromise. And it worked until 2020, when first the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, the notorious Quds Force commander, and he occupied a very special place within the regime. Then soon after, the Biden administration did something that was not that important strategically for the United States, but it had a devastating political effect in Iran. He started attacking Iran proxies in Iraq and Syria. The regime, especially its supporters, took that very seriously and were offended by how the regime was, how the state was not responding to that, not defending its proxies. And then, since the October 7 attack, you see Israel cracking down on Hamas. Houthis are still somewhat intact, but diminished. Hezbollah has ceased being a capable force, of course. Nasrallah, who was second only to Soleimani in his stature and Khomeini aside, has been killed. Senior leadership of Hamas have been killed in Iran, Haniya especially. Bashar al-Assad has fallen. So Iran has lost everything it had. Islamic Republic has lost, I should say, everything it had as a claim to legitimacy, except for its nuclear program. Nuclear program was the last thing that kept the state in its current form legitimate. And now the Islamic Republic might have lost that. But that's why it was never going to give up its nuclear program, because it was not merely a foreign policy tool. It was the last bastion of legitimacy for Khomeini and the Islamic Republic.
Given the changes that have taken place that you so eloquently detailed, and given the demographic revolution that's taken place, and the apparent military weakness of the regime now, talk about where that leaves the regime today.
In disarray. I think that's the one word answer. I don't think anybody can really say that for sure where the regime is right now. I think they are analyzing the situation themselves to see where they are. I would say that the crisis is the crisis of legitimacy is there, and keep in mind that the revolutionaries become more extreme, not less, as time passes, each generation passes. You look at the Soviet Union, the generation that came after Lenin and Stalin were even more dogmatic than the first generations, because they didn't have to participate in the revolution themselves to practice the politics of compromise to get to where they needed to be. They were accustomed to absolute power, and under totalitarianism, they could get whatever they wanted without having to compromise much. And on top of that, they had been indoctrinated into the politics of extremism and absolutism. So it took a while before the communists realized, it took a few generations before they realized that the politics of absolutism they were practicing was not going to work. It was until Gorbachev. Same thing with Iran. The new younger generation of revolutionaries in Iran are even more extreme than the previous generations. When you look at the reformists today, they are Khomeinists. They claim legitimacy to Khomeini, think that the current structure has gone too far in extremism. And the generation that will come after will be even more extreme than the current generation of rulers. You have that. So just as a reference, Rouhani, the previous president, and Pezeshkian, the current president, who are more associated with the reform camp, They both were prominent or somewhat prominent members of the revolution in 1979. Ahmadinejad, the notoriously extremist president, he was a young guy at the time of the revolution. He grew in the ranks of the state after the revolution, whereas Rouhani was the deputy commander during Iran rank. And this trend will continue. The current issue is not that people who are within the state who are turning on the Islamic Republic are going to turn on the Islamic Republic out of liberal principles. Rather, they're going to turn on it for having failed the revolutionary ideals, and they're going to go after it from a more extreme point of view. Khamenei has to figure out how he wants to respond, and they need to figure out how they want to engage with Khamenei within the regime. On the one hand, he's an old man who might die, so you might as well just wait it out for him to die. On the other hand, he has failed the revolution, he has failed the regime, so you might want to go after him. There's 10 to 20% of the population that supports Khamenei and upholds this regime. What we should be looking for is how they're going to react to this war, whether they're going to accept that this was a catastrophic failure and that they have lost their nuclear program and that they are defeated. I cannot give you a perfect answer about how this is going to come out. I just can't tell you what we should be looking for. On the other hand, you have a vast majority of the population that is against this regime, and they would want to change it. The problem is that one of my favorite quotes is from a czarist before the revolution. And he says, as a rule, a regime perishes not because of the strength of its enemies, but the uselessness of its defenders. It doesn't matter how many people are against this regime inside Iran. They don't have the guns. What matters is the people with the guns, the defenders of the regime, well, how they feel. The Iranian people hate this regime, but they cannot do anything about it because in 2019, they took the streets and within 4 days, the regime massacred 1,500 people. They were shooting at people from helicopters. There's no way that you can overthrow a regime just by sheer number of people. The regime knows how to crack down. The question we should be looking for is, will the supporters of the regime continue to crack down on the people, or will they come at a point to believe that this is a failed state? By failed state, I mean it has failed its ideals and that they should look beyond it. And it doesn't mean necessarily look beyond it in a liberal way, but rather perhaps more extreme way, but that could give us an opening as long as they don't come to the defense of the state against the people.
And finally, given where we are now, what do you see as the ideal actions that the U.S. or Israel can take right now?
Overtly, much more the United States. Covertly, much more Israel. Israel did take out much of Iran's suppression capacity. It was going after targets like the Minister of the State or Minister of the Interior, which is not a threat to Israeli security. That's a domestic suppression, or went after Internal Security Command. Again, that's things that the state uses against the Iranian people. Those are not institutions that shoot at Israel. It was obviously trying to degrade states' capacity to crack down on protests. Things like that, more overtly, could be done much more efficiently by the United States, but Israelis can do it too. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of it is overt things, engaging with the Islamic Republic's elite to see which one of them could be potentially recruited to convince their colleagues, I wouldn't say stop cracking down on protesters, but at least to do a less competent job, let's say, about that, to be able to supply protesters and people with what they need, be it intelligence, training. One big thing is communications technology. Iran is very good at every time there's a protest, they shut down the internet so people cannot coordinate protests. Another thing I have suggested is if there are protests, it might be good for Israeli or American fighters to reoccupy Iranian skies so Iran could not use its helicopters to crack down on protests. That's possibly the most effective weapon Iran has. Another one engage with the Iranian opposition and find a leader they can trust. There are different candidates. I'm not going to just one against the other. That's a different can of worms. But to pick a winner among the opposition, that this is our guy or our gal, that we're going to stick with this opposition leader. And when the regime falls, this person will lead the transition and work with that person effectively to lead a protest movement. Iran has another problem, which is it has a protest movement, but it doesn't have a leader in it. It's very and that protest movement is also in disarray because it doesn't know where to take its cues from. And finding an opposition leader and not just engaging with that, but also utilizing that leader's legitimacy inside to prepare him or her for transition, to give that person the tools for leadership is quite important. And that's something that we have not done ever. And that is, by the way, one thing that we failed to do in Iraq. We've not to relitigate that war too much, but in 2001 and 2002, there was a lot of efforts, and especially in the prelude to the war, to engage with the Iraqi opposition. This was within the Pentagon to prepare for a transition government. And the Pentagon wanted to do that. The State Department did its best to prevent it from happening because they didn't want the war to happen at all. So they were trying to kneecap the Pentagon's efforts. But if the Pentagon had succeeded, which it did not eventually, if the Pentagon had succeeded in convening an opposition government, or I guess exile government with a leadership, so right after the war, that government could take over Iraq, we could have possibly prevented the anarchy that followed. And nobody's talking about a ground invasion of Iran like in Iraq. But that is nonetheless a risk always after a regime falls, whether there could be a replacement to prevent anarchy. And that's always in the cards with Iran. Anarchy in Iran would be against everybody's interest. It potentially could be even worse than for US and Israeli interests than what we have currently. So to convene that government in exile, to be able to take over immediately after the collapse of the Islamic Republic would be quite important. We should not be just thinking about the collapse of the Islamic Republic, but also the day after of it. Not the year after of it, a day after it, quite literally.
And in terms of all of this, what do you see, and we're just about out of time, what do you see as a timeline? Within what framework does this action need to happen now?
Sooner than later, because the Islamic Republic is at its most vulnerable state, potentially since its birth, certainly since the Iran-Iraq war. And these are quite clever people. They're not morons. They know how to rebuild legitimacy. So if we are for regime change, this is our best moment. Now, there's an even greater risk than losing our momentum and allowing them to rebuild legitimacy, which is that they fail to rebuild that legitimacy and that the regime collapses on its face. What comes next? Ideally, you will get a more extreme government by people who think that Khamenei was too soft. You get an IRGC dictatorship who is now going to really stick it to Israelis. That's a good best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that you get a civil war in Iran, you get anarchy, and suddenly you get 92 million people. Forget about the human tragedy that we will see in Iran, which would be devastating. In Syria, we lost 500,000 people, and that was a much smaller population, but tens of millions of people potentially as refugees. And you saw what that did to not just the region, but also to European politics, Arabs entering European countries, and that led to the rise of far-right parties in Europe. Now, multiply that by several magnitudes. Refugees from Iran arriving in Germany and Austria and Italy and France. Can you imagine what it will do to their societies and their politics, let alone our politics? Let's not forget that Donald Trump's moment to to become and solidify his lead in the GOP primaries. One was the Muslim ban in reaction to a few Syrian refugees who were being admitted to the United States, and just the worry of a repeat of that. Can you imagine what it will do to our politics? It's not a pretty picture.
Shay Khatiri, I thank you so very much for spending time with us today.
Of course, thank you, Jay.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. I hope you join us next week for another Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.